Another death row inmate is executed by the electric chair. 61-year-old David Earl Miller was pronounced dead at 7:25 this evening. He was convicted in the 1981 death of 23-year-old Lee Standifer of Knoxville.
A 61-year-old man is strapped into a wooden electric chair. His head is shaved clean. Saltwater sponges are pressed against his scalp and ankles. His hands are restrained. His skin is pale. He looks tired, defeated, small. His name is David Earl Miller. The warden steps forward and asks for final words. Miller mumbles something. The warden asks him to repeat it. His attorney leans in and speaks for the record. 4 words. 36 years of meaning packed into 4 words. At 7:16 in the evening, 1,750 volts tear through his body. 9 minutes later, the curtain closes. At 7:25, a voice announces his death. What the state of Tennessee did to David Earl Miller did not begin on December 6th. It began decades earlier, and what you are about to hear is impossible to believe. Welcome back to the channel. Before we go any further, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. 1. Today, we are going all the way back to 1981. To a Knoxville library, a date that turned deadly, and a legal battle that would drag on for nearly 4 decades. Before we talk about what happened, you need to know who Lee Standifer was. She was born on May 22nd, 1957, in Colorado. She came into the world with mild brain damage, but that never slowed her down. Not even close. Her mother, Helen, described her as a bubbly, happy character. She teased her sister at Christmas. She competed in Special Olympics and won a gold medal in backstroke. She graduated from Farragut High School. She moved to Tennessee, got herself a job at a food processing plant, and held it down for 2 full years. Her supervisors loved her. Lee lived on her own at the YWCA in downtown Knoxville. She was active in 4-H. She visited the Knoxville Public Library regularly, and every single night, without fail, she called her mother. That is where she met David Earl Miller, at the YWCA. They grew close. They started dating. On the night of May 20th, 1981, Lee was 2 days away from turning 24. It was supposed to be just another date. She never made it home. Her mother knew something was wrong the moment that nightly call never came. What police found the next morning would haunt investigators for over 3 decades. David Earl Miller was born on July 16, 1957, in Toledo, Ohio. His mother got pregnant from a one-night stand. He never knew his father. His mother drank heavily while pregnant. She later suffered brain damage from toxic fumes at a plastics plant. She remarried when Miller was just 10 months old, and his stepfather was a violent alcoholic. Per court records, that stepfather knocked Miller out of chairs, beat him with boards, threw him into a refrigerator hard enough to dent it and bloody his head, dragged him by the hair, and twice drove his head through walls. Miller also claimed he was sexually abused by a female cousin at age 5, by a friend of his grandfather at age 12, and by his own mother at age 15. His family disputed those claims. By age 6, he had tried to hang himself. By age 10, he was drinking, smoking marijuana, and huffing gasoline daily. At 13, he was sent to a reform school where, per court records, counselors beat the boys and covered up molestation. In 1974, he joined the Marines. He deserted. He drifted. He fathered a daughter he never raised. He was arrested twice for rape. Both times, the victims were too afraid to press charges. Both times, he walked free. He eventually hitchhiked into East Tennessee, where Reverend Benjamin Calvin Thomas, an ordained minister, took him in. That house would become the scene of Lee Standifer's murder. By the time David Earl Miller crossed paths with Lee Standifer, he was already a dangerous man. 2 women had reported him to police for rape. 2 separate cases, 2 arrests, and both times the charges went nowhere. The victims were too afraid to follow through. So Miller walked free. Twice. No consequences. No intervention. No record that stuck. His drug use was getting worse. Per his own later confession, Miller had already consumed drugs before he even met up with Lee on the evening of May 20th, 1981. The day started like nothing was wrong. Miller and Lee visited the Trailways bus station cafeteria together. Then they went to the Knoxville Public Library, the same place Lee loved, the same place she felt comfortable. After that, they headed to the home of Reverend Benjamin Calvin Thomas in South Knoxville. That was where Miller had been living since 1979. Just a regular evening. That is how it looked from the outside. But inside that house, something shifted. According to court records, at some point during the evening, Lee tried to physically hold on to Miller. She was clinging to him, trying to stop him from leaving her side. That, Miller later claimed, was when he hit her. He said the attack began in that moment, that he was under the influence, that he did not even remember stabbing her. But the forensic evidence would tell a completely different story. 2 women had already reported David Miller to police. Both were too afraid to follow through. Lee Standifer did not get the chance to make that choice. Let's be clear about one thing. There were no co-conspirators in this case, no accomplices, no one else involved. David Earl Miller acted entirely alone. But what this case did have was a debate, one that would run through every courtroom, every appeal, and every legal filing for nearly 4 decades. The question was simple. Did Miller plan this, or did it happen in a moment of drug-fueled impulse? The prosecution's answer was firm. Look at what he did afterward. After Lee was dead, Miller cleaned the blood off the walls and floors of Reverend Thomas's home. He disposed of her body by hanging it on a dogwood tree in the backyard. When Reverend Thomas came home and noticed traces of blood, Miller looked him in the eye and lied. He said it was a nosebleed from a fight, nothing more. The next morning, Reverend Thomas gave Miller a ride. Miller stepped out of the vehicle and fled the state. To the prosecution, those actions showed a man who was thinking clearly, a man who knew exactly what he had done. The defense told a different story. Miller had consumed LSD and alcohol before the evening began. His history of severe trauma had already damaged him deeply. Per court records, Miller himself said he did not even remember stabbing Lee, only that he struck her, and then she was not breathing. 2 stories, 1 jury, and the truth buried somewhere in between. Before we get to what police found at that crime scene, and the forensic details are unlike anything I have covered on this channel, make sure you are subscribed and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. 1. May 20th, 1981 started like any other day. That afternoon, Miller and Lee visited the Trailways bus station cafeteria together. Then they went to the Knoxville Public Library. Witnesses saw them. Nothing seemed unusual. No arguments, no tension. Just 2 people spending time together. After the library, they headed to the home of Reverend Benjamin Calvin Thomas in South Knoxville, the same house where Miller had been living since 1979. That was the last place Lee Standifer was seen alive. At some point that evening, inside that house, the attack began. What followed was not a single blow in a moment of anger. What followed was something far worse. According to court records and forensic testimony, Miller beat Lee with a fireplace poker. The pathologist found 2 severe wounds on her head, one on the right side of her forehead, one above her left eye. Each wound was roughly 3 inches long and ½ an inch wide. The force was enough to fracture her skull and cause a subarachnoid hematoma, bleeding on the brain. Then came the stab wounds. The pathologist concluded a Bowie knife was used. The wounds were not light, they were deep, delivered with tremendous force. 1 stab wound fully penetrated her neck and shattered her jawbone. 5 more were found on her chest, 1 on her stomach, 1 on the floor of her mouth, 2 more on her back, 1 piercing a rib, 1 striking her shoulder blade. 1 wound measured 8 to 9 inches deep. It went straight through and penetrated her heart and aorta. Multiple bruises were found on her upper thighs. Traces of spermatozoa were recovered from her body, suggesting possible sexual assault. And then, per the forensic report, some of those wounds were inflicted after Lee was already dead. After the attack, Miller dragged her body out of the house and hung it on a dogwood tree in the backyard. He then went back inside and cleaned the blood from the walls, floors, and surfaces. When Reverend Thomas came home and noticed the remaining blood stains, Miller told him it was from a nosebleed, a fight, nothing serious. Thomas told him to move out. The next morning, Thomas gave Miller a ride. Miller got out of the vehicle and vanished. Thomas drove back home and found Lee's body in the backyard. At the same time, Helen Standifer had already called the police. Lee had missed her nightly call. She had not shown up for work. Helen knew something was wrong. She was right. What happened next is impossible to believe. A murderer on the run, arrested not for murder, but for something far less dramatic. And it was that arrest that would change everything. Miller did not stick around. After stepping out of Reverend Thomas's vehicle that morning, he hit the road. No plan, no destination. He hitchhiked out of Tennessee and made his way to Columbus, Ohio. There was no dramatic pursuit, no nationwide manhunt, no roadblocks or urgent alerts, just a drifter moving quietly through the country, while a young woman's body hung on a dogwood tree in a backyard in South Knoxville. 9 days passed. Then, on May 29th, 1981, David Earl Miller walked into a bar in Columbus, Ohio, and tried to pay his tab with a counterfeit $10 bill. That was it. That was the moment it all fell apart. He was arrested on the spot, not for murder, for a fake $10 bill. But once he was in custody, Miller confessed. He told Ohio authorities that he had beaten a woman to death in Tennessee while under the influence of drugs. Just like that. He said it himself. He was transferred to Tennessee State Police shortly after to face a first-degree murder charge. Back in Knoxville, Helen Standifer was told that her daughter was gone. The same daughter who had called her every single night without fail. Gone 2 days before her 24th birthday. Reverend Thomas cooperated fully with investigators. His account of that evening, the bloodstains, the lie, would become critical evidence at trial. Lead Detective Jim Winston later recalled that the crime scene photos were so disturbing, the court chose not to display them publicly. He said that delivering the news to the Standifer family was something he never fully recovered from. Miller had already confessed. Investigators knew who did it. But knowing and proving, in a court of law, are two very different things. The legal process moved quickly at first. On August 3, 1981, a Knox County jury indicted David Earl Miller on a single charge of first-degree murder. The charge carried the death penalty under Tennessee state law. But before the trial could begin, there was a question that had to be answered. Was Miller mentally fit to stand trial? On October 19, 1981, a competency hearing was ordered. Miller was examined by Dr. George G., a psychiatrist at the Helen Ross McNabb Center in Knoxville. In November of 1981, Dr. G delivered his conclusion. Miller was fit to be tried. The defense pushed back immediately. They requested a second medical opinion, arguing that one psychiatrist was not enough given Miller's history. That request was denied. With the competency question settled, both sides began building their cases. The defense's argument was straightforward. Miller was not legally sane on the night of the murder. He had consumed LSD and alcohol. His entire childhood had been shaped by violence, abuse, and trauma. Combined, those factors, the defense argued, left him incapable of forming any premeditated intent to kill. The prosecution had a different set of facts to work with. Multiple witnesses had seen Miller and Lee together that day. None of them reported anything unusual. No visible intoxication, no erratic behavior. No signs of distress. Per court records, Miller appeared calm and composed in public right up until the moment he and Lee walked through that front door. The jury would hear two completely different versions of David Earl Miller. What they decided, and how long it took, would set the stage for one of the longest death row sagas in Tennessee history. In most murder cases, the breakthrough comes after weeks of investigation. Dead ends, missed leads, pressure from the public. Not here. David Earl Miller handed investigators their breakthrough himself. He confessed. Sitting in police custody in Columbus, Ohio, he told authorities he had beaten a woman to death in Tennessee while under the influence of drugs. The case did not stall. It did not go cold. It began with a confession. That meant the prosecution's job was not to figure out who did it. They already knew. Their job was to build a case strong enough to survive what the defense was going to throw at them: a mental illness argument, an intoxication defense, and decades of documented trauma. So investigators built carefully. The forensic pathology report alone was damning. It detailed the full extent of Lee's injuries: the head wounds, the stab wounds, the depth and force behind each one. It confirmed that some wounds were inflicted after Lee was already dead. It noted traces of spermatozoa, suggesting possible sexual assault. Reverend Benjamin Calvin Thomas provided a first-hand account that was equally powerful. He had seen Miller in that house. He had noticed the bloodstains. He had heard the lie about a nosebleed. And he had found Lee's body himself the following morning. Then there were Miller's prior arrest records. 2 separate cases involving rape accusations, both resulting in no indictments because the victims were too afraid to come forward. Those records would later become far more significant than anyone anticipated. The case went to trial in March 1982, less than 1 year after the murder. The trial began in March of 1982. The defense stood firm on one argument. David Earl Miller was not legally sane on the night of the murder. He was intoxicated on LSD and alcohol. His history of severe abuse had left him mentally damaged. Premeditation, they argued, was simply not possible. The prosecution disagreed. They brought in expert psychiatric witnesses who testified that Miller was legally sane at the time of the killing. They pointed to the witnesses who saw him that day, calm, composed, functioning normally in public. The jury deliberated and came back with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. On March 17, 1982, 24-year-old David Earl Miller was sentenced to death. But the story did not end there. On May 29, 1984, the Tennessee Supreme Court reviewed Miller's appeal. The court upheld the murder conviction without question. However, the death sentence was a different matter. The court overturned it. The reason was technical, but significant. During the original sentencing phase, prosecutors had introduced Miller's prior rape arrests as evidence. No charges had ever been filed in either case. No indictments, no convictions. The court ruled that using those arrests against him during sentencing was improper. A new sentencing trial was ordered. In February of 1987, a second jury convened, this time solely to decide punishment. Their verdict was the same: death. The jury found that the murder of Lee Standifer was, in their words, especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Miller appealed again. The Tennessee Supreme Court rejected it on April 24, 1989. He appealed to the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals, rejected on November 19, 1999. Back to the Tennessee Supreme Court, rejected on August 29, 2001. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed his final appeal on September 13, 2012. Every door closed. Every appeal denied. 36 years of waiting? David Earl Miller spent 36 years on Tennessee's death row. 36 years of appeals. 36 years of petitions. 36 years of waiting for a date that kept getting pushed further down the road. Until it didn't. At the time of his execution, he was the longest-serving death row inmate in the state of Tennessee. By November of 2018, every legal option was nearly gone. But Miller had one final fight left. And it was not about whether he would die. It was about how. On November 5, 2018, Miller and 3 fellow inmates, Nicholas Todd Sutton, Terry Lynn King, and Stephen Michael West, filed a federal lawsuit. They did not want to die by lethal injection. They asked the court to allow execution by firing squad instead. Their argument was grounded in what happened to Billy Ray Irick. Irick had been executed in Tennessee in October of 2018, using the state's 3-drug lethal injection protocol. The first drug was midazolam, a sedative. Witnesses reported that Irick coughed and turned purple for 20 minutes. A leading anesthesiologist submitted an affidavit stating that Irick was aware and sentient during the process, and would have experienced choking, drowning in his own fluids, suffocating, being buried alive, and the burning sensation caused by potassium chloride. And on November 20th, 2018, the federal court rejected the lawsuit. On November 28th, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that rejection. Miller was left with two options under Tennessee law: lethal injection or the electric chair. On November 27, 2018, he chose the electric chair. He became only the second Tennessee inmate to make that choice. In 2018, after Edmund Zagorski, who was executed by electrocution on November 1st, his attorneys argued it was not a real choice. It was coercion. The courts disagreed. By selecting electrocution, Miller was ruled to have legally given up his right to challenge it. Justice Sonia Sotomayor dissented. She wrote that electrocution can be a dreadful way to die, but acknowledged there was credible scientific evidence that lethal injection as currently practiced in Tennessee may well be even worse. Her conclusion was sharp: such madness should not continue. On December 4, 2018, Miller was moved to a death watch cell. 24-hour surveillance. 2 days left. On December 6th, Governor Bill Haslam denied clemency. His entire response was one sentence: "After careful consideration of David Earl Miller's clemency request, I am declining to intervene in this case." 31 words. 36 years reduced to 31 words. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to stop the execution. For his final meal, Miller ordered fried chicken, mashed potatoes, biscuits, and coffee. At 7:12 in the evening, the blind over the witness window rose. Miller was already strapped into the wooden electric chair, head shaved, saltwater sponges pressed to his skin, wearing a cream-colored jumpsuit. He looked tired, defeated. The warden asked for final words. Miller mumbled something. The warden asked him to repeat it. His attorney spoke up and clarified for the record, Beats being on death row. A heavy black cloth was placed over his face. At 7:16 in the evening, 1,750 volts tore through his body for 20 seconds. Witnesses watched him stiffen and thrust upward against the leather restraints. His hands clenched into fists. Then a pause. A second jolt. 15 seconds. Then stillness. At 7:25 in the evening, David Earl Miller was pronounced dead. The curtain closed. Outside in the December cold, Miller's attorney, Steve Kissinger, stood before the cameras and asked a question that no one in that room could answer. What did we do here today? No one from either family attended the execution. Not Miller's, not the Standifer made her position clear. After 37 years, she said, "This has become about him, and I don't want to acknowledge or honor him in any way." She wanted it finished. She wanted it back about her daughter. Detective Jim Winston never forgot. He kept a news clipping from the case for over 3 decades. He said he was proud to have brought Miller to justice. David Earl Miller was the 1,488th person executed in America since 1976, the 9th in Tennessee, the 160th by electrocution. Lee Standifer never made it to her 24th birthday. She called her mother every single night, right up until the night she couldn't. A man who spent 36 years waiting to die summed it all up in 4 words. And somehow those 4 words said everything. What moment in this story hit you the hardest? Was it Lee's story? The choice between 2 forms of death? Or those 4 final words? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this opened your eyes, hit that like button and subscribe. Because next week, we are covering another case that will leave you with just as many questions as answers.